So, Jacopo Torregrossa, I'm really excited to finally have a chance to talk with you after, I don't know, almost a year and a half that I've been here. And so it's awesome to have you as one of my guests for my Voices and share your voice with our viewers. And more than me reading people's resumes and whatever, I'm always more interested in asking you what your history has been, because so before you tell us your expertise, so you are Italian from the center of Italy.
Yeah.
And so how come you ended up in Frankfurt? So what moved you to leave Italy? Did it have to do because of what you studied, or what's your history, a little bit of this?
Thank you very much, Rebecca, first of all, for inviting me to this format, which I follow and I really like it. And
You're welcome.
I really like also to see all the experience of people who come to you and share their stories.
Thank
so
you.
I'm happy also to share my story in some sense. So I was born and raised in Italy, and I also studied there at the university. And I studied philosophy as a bachelor's student and also as a master's student, but with a great interest in linguistics. So that's what brought me here. And when I was doing the university, actually, I did Erasmus in Berlin. And that's where I fell in love with Germany. And I thought, okay, this could be a nice place to live. So I started to do my PhD between Italy and part of it also in the United States. But after finishing it, I thought, okay, Germany could be a nice place to do like research. So this is what brought me. And as soon as I saw that there were like different research possibilities to develop like a research program here in Germany, I decided to move and to travel around university. I mean, I was in Cologne first, and then I moved to Hamburg, and now I landed in Frankfurt in 2019. And what drove me was always this interest in research and the possibility to do research with projects with my own team and to build actually on the previous research and do new projects. And so on, but also this love for teaching, because I really enjoy teaching, and to get to know new students and to, in some sense, share my experience with them. And it has been wonderful until now. And so I feel really comfortable here in Germany and in this research environment.
So you came into languages after philosophy. You came into languages. But saying languages is very broad. So what part of the languages is what you are interested in and what your expertise?
I've always had like a great interest in language acquisition. So in this mystery, how children can acquire so fast, for example, in a very quick way, languages, and in some sense also in a very automatic way. And so I'm really interested in this development, and also how this language development goes hand in hand with this cognitive development. So I find it fascinating, for example, that at one point children develop some intuitions about their languages, some representation about their languages, some abstract representation about their languages.
Subconsciously. Yes.
So I always give this example, which is taken from a famous psychologist, Carmelo Smith, and she says, she reports actually a dialogue between her and her daughter. And the daughter asks, okay, what's this? And the mother says, that's a typewriter. And the child says, no, you're the typewriter, that's a typewrite. Because she thinks that all the words that actually end in ER are words that indicate somebody performing an action.
Like so, the painter.
Exactly,
or
the painter, the runner, the writer,
yes.
and so on. So actually what she says is wrong, because this is a typewriter, but she reveals something really interesting about her intuitions and her representations about language. And so this is really amazing. So my interest is actually to see this development in language and how this development in language correlates with development in cognition in some sense.
It goes hand in hand, of
It
course.
goes hand in hand. So this was my first interest. But of course, whenever you deal with abstract representations, with learning, with development, you start to understand what are the conditions of language learning in the school. And so I started to work with schools, and I started to, in some sense, realize that what is important in the school and what is important in a child's life is actually to celebrate his or her language resources. So if you're dealing, for example, with a multilingual child, then it is important to celebrate this multilingualism in the classroom, for example, at home, and to, in some sense, leverage this multilingualism for learning, because the multilingual children are always immersed in different languages, and the idea is that they should rely on all these languages while learning, and not, for example, just turn off one language because they are immersed in another language and so on. So the idea is that I started to actually look at language development in children, just considering children independently of society, independently of school. And then I started to realize, well, school plays a big role in language learning, language development. And that's why I got into the schools, and I got into research about schools and about education. And what I do at the moment is actually to try to establish a bridge between psycholinguistic, so language acquisition in some sense, which means how language acquisition, how language develops hand in hand with cognition, and to establish this bridge between psycholinguistics and education. So how actually the school setting affects this linguistic and cognitive development.
And this is especially or more and more important in a globalized world. So decades ago, there was very little exchange from that one. People from one country go into another one in different languages, or the heritage language is different than the language they speak there. But this is increasing. So there's more and more people traveling and going to live from one country to another, so for different reasons, for voluntary reasons or forced reasons with everything that's going around. So this is all the time becoming a more critical issue. We are in a very international city, Frankfurt, and in which there's a very important percentage of the population that come from abroad, and German is not their native language, or many people don't even know German. So I've heard a lot of people that have been here even for several years, and they still don't know German. So this is clearly a very important subject that is also, you've spoken of this, how important it is for a person, no matter if they are children, teenagers, adults, or old people. So tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. So I think that first of all, we have to think, okay, this movement, this migration, and this multilingualism is actually part of humanity. So it's not just this period of time which is related to this, but if we think, for example, at movements within the Mediterranean, right, the Mediterranean Sea, there was a lot of multilingualism. But now there is this attention to multilingualism because in some sense, schools, for example, so I just focus on schools, but this could be like work environments, are multilinguals. So as you were saying, in some sense, we are in classrooms that are classrooms in public German schools in which different languages are spoken, and we have also different proficiency in different languages. So we may find children, for example, that speak a language at home which is not German. We may find children who speak two languages at home that are not German. So we have different language configurations. And the main idea is that this has been seen as a problem most of the time because teachers might not know how to deal with all these languages. And so they want just to focus on the learning of German, and they think that the best way to learn German is actually to immerse the children in this German environment and to give continuous input in German.
So somebody who at home speaks Italian and English, and they come to Germany and they go to school, so they should only speak, learn, read, listen to German in school, only German.
This is what people might believe, that this immersion in German is actually the best way to learn German.
Okay.
This could be the case. So, I mean, we know that if you are immersed in a language, especially children can, in some sense, catch this language, right? But this involves also, in some sense, shutting off other languages. So the main idea here is that the child has language resources, and there are certain abilities and certain competences that he might share between languages. So if we turn off one of these languages, probably the children can learn a bit less with respect to when they are allowed to use all their own language repertoire. So what we want to show actually in our research is that if we activate the other language in the classroom, this is beneficial also for learning content and language. And content, I mean content in German, because most of the school offers content in German, but also the German language. So the main idea is that we can learn German via immersion to German, but we can also learn German via reflections, for example, on how our own language and German differ from each other or are similar from each other. So I'll give you an example. For example, a German child can have some receptive knowledge of Dutch or Norwegian or Swedish because they are similar to each other. And sometimes when this German child, for example, learns English, he has other resources, for example, to understand Dutch, because there are some words that are more similar to English with respect to German. So the fact is that the more languages we speak, the more resources we have to understand new content and new languages.
Is it why we would learn an additional language easier than when we already know two, then the third one is easier, and the fourth one is still easier, and so on?
Because in some sense we know we can transfer some knowledge from one language to the other.
Okay.
So this is the first point. And we can also transfer certain strategies to learn languages from one language to the other.
Okay.
So I mean, it's not just content and language, the fact that I may see, for example, that café and coffee are similar between English and German, but I also know which strategies I used to learn a second or a third language, and then I can transfer these strategies to learn a third language, for example.
So the process, the strategies, we already, like, we know the drill, so we just apply it on the next language.
Exactly.
Okay.
So because our idea is that actually whenever we learn a language, we have to learn everything from scratch. But this is not the case, because we have already one language, we have already another language, we have different strategies to learn them, so we can build on this. So that's the main idea that we want to convey in our research. The fact that in order to learn content and language, we should not turn off our linguistic repertoire that we have, our baggage in some sense that we have, our heritage, but we should celebrate it and activate it, because this actually enhances the learning process. So that's the main idea.
What happens, so we're talking about German, Italian, English, maybe Spanish, French, and so on. But what happens when it's a language with a different alphabet? So I don't know, Chinese, Hebrew, Korean, Japanese, whatever.
Yeah, and this is actually even better in some sense, because you don't have any interference effect. So if you have like different alphabets, this might be even better. Because, for example, if you have two different alphabets, you can develop quite easily a metalinguistic awareness. What does it mean? So metalinguistic awareness is the fact that we understand that the sign that we use, written signs, or also oral signs, in some sense, language itself, are arbitrary. In the sense that, so the language is separated from reality.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if we take like a child and we say, okay, this is a pen, right? The child does not really distinguish between the word pen and the pen itself. So it tends to identify the pen, the word object. Pen with the object. Yeah. But let us take the perspective of a bilingual. So yes, already two words to indicate the pen, right? It could be pen and penna in Italian. So this means actually that he has a better intuition about the fact that language is separated from reality. And this is the first step to reflect on language in an abstract way. And this happens also with respect to the writing system, right? In the sense that we understand that this is just a convention, this is just, in some sense, a system to, for example, to write. And this allows us to see better what are the abstract mechanisms of writing, in some sense. And so we work with both children that have some literacy in their own language, like children here in Germany who can write in Chinese, for example, because, for example, they attend like Saturday schools and they learn to write Chinese there. But we also work with children who do not have literacy in the language. And in this case, what we are doing is actually, so these children might have the impression, for example, that when they learn English, English is quite far away from Chinese.
So it seems, yes.
Yeah, but actually there are certain structures that they can transfer from Chinese to English.
Okay.
So, for example, if we take like a compound word in English, like schoolmates, for example, well, it is the same word order in Chinese. In Chinese, we have like the same word order. They say schoolmate. I won't pronounce it in Chinese because I'm not really good with Chinese. But the children can realize, look, I can transfer this word order from Chinese to English without problems. And this is something, for example, that a Spanish speaker or an Italian speaker cannot do. He has to learn the rule.
Change the order.
Because it changed the order, because we say, for example, compañeros de clase or compagni di classe, so in which mates is actually compañeros, is actually compagni. So that's why this is something that we cannot transfer, but the Chinese speaker can transfer this knowledge. So we have to identify these structures that can be transferred, and we have to identify also structures that cannot be transferred, but children can actually be attentive to them and understand the differences between languages. So it's not just similarities, it's also differences.
Which also helps you remember something.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah. So, but we're talking about, I'm thinking about things that go on subconsciously. So it's like when a baby starts finally speaking mama, dada, and so on. Everything goes up in a subconscious level. You're not thinking, I have to learn the word for this woman who feeds me every day or whatever. And this learning process of a language goes on subconsciously, especially in children, but also in adults, because as adults, I'm here perfecting my German, and it's stressful because I'm always thinking, I have to use the right article, and then so many things, no? And we're afraid to make mistakes, and we try to consciously seek for these differences or similarities, and to remember the words and so on. But there's a lot going on subconsciously.
Yeah, there is a lot going on also from an intuition point of view, in some sense. And this is really from an automatic point of view. And this is really interesting what you're saying, because of course there is a difference between children and adults, how they acquire languages. Because of course the plasticity of the brain is different in the two age spans, in some sense. And this is reflected on how we learn. But there is also something else, the fact that adults I usually used to think that, for example, to learn a language would mean to, in some sense, approach the level of a native speaker in that language.
Yes.
So we have this idea, this very normative idea, that learning a language means approaching a certain level, which is a native speaker level,
perfection
in that language. And this, in some sense, might block us because we have really high standards. And then we have these developed metalinguistic knowledge, in the sense that we try to understand what is the rule, which might enhance learning in some sense. But in some sense, it might block learning. Yes. Because we have always this native speaker idea and ideal, right? Which is not important if we think about it, because we don't want to be native speaker in that language. We want to have like functional communication in that language, and this is what matters in some sense.
But we forget this when we're trying to speak a language we do not really know.
Exactly. And we are like, we have these high standards, and so we have this idea that what we want to see doesn't reflect, in some sense, our metalinguistic knowledge. We are afraid of doing mistakes.
Or pronouncing incorrectly.
Of pronouncing it.
Yes.
And so we have all these ideas that our language should be perfect. And this is something that might block us in our, in some sense, like development of the language. And so that's why we might have like a different process. But what I wanted to say is that still, when you are learning a language, I think that everybody of us had the experience to arrive at a certain point, which is not necessarily a native language point, in which we start to develop intuitions about language. So for example, if I give you two structures and I said, what do you think is better in German? And German is my second language, and it is also your second language, and so on, you start to think, I think this is better.
This one sounds more correct.
Sounds more correct, and you don't know why. So this means actually that you don't approach the problem from an explicit rule-based point of view. You approach the problem from an implicit point of view. This sounds better. I have the intuition. And this is what native speakers do, right? I have the intuition that this is better, but sometimes I cannot explain why.
Well, actually, a native speaker, if you ask him what the rule of whatever grammar is, they almost for sure don't know it.
Yeah,
but they use it correctly.
It depends to what extent, actually, they were trained in the school to reflect on their own language. I think that this is important, to reflect on our own language, because we can build from here, actually, to develop further language systems. This is important, but not every school, not every literacy experience relates to this reflecting on languages. And that's why, for example, certain native speakers don't know why certain things happen.
Yeah.
Because this is related, and we come back to our school experiences, this is related to school. This is related to the experiences that we did in school, and how different school settings might affect the way in which we look at languages.
How much they focused on grammar or not, and
yeah, exactly.
How much they reinforced you knowing the rules, no? Yeah.
And to make you an example about this native speaker ideal that might block us, so we have certain activities that relate to multilingual identity with children. And what is really interesting is that these children think that certain languages, for example, Turkish, Chinese, or Italian, Spanish, belong to them. So, because these are languages that are spoken by classmates in the classroom, and even if they do not have any proficiency in this language, or they just know some words from their friends, still they think that these languages are part of their identity, or they are part of their future identity, because they say, oh, this sounds so nice that I want to learn it. So in some sense, as adults, we usually tend not to think about the fact that other languages could be part of our repertoire, because these are languages that surround us. And children do it because, again, I think that adults are really stuck to the idea that in order to consider a language as part of your repertoire, you should, in some sense, speak that language properly. So I would not consider, for example, Russian as part of my repertoire because I don't know any Russian, right? And this is the adult mind setting.
But you understand, for example, Portuguese. We were talking about this, that you, even if, and I do too, even if we cannot really speak Portuguese, we understand it. So could we say that there's some knowledge of Portuguese we have?
There is also some knowledge of Portuguese. So there are studies that show, for example, that if you have a good competence in Italian and Spanish, in 6 weeks, you can have like a receptive knowledge in Portuguese that equals the B2 level of the
I've got to
just
do this.
receptive. Exactly. So you can read it, you can understand it, and so on. So in some sense, we have some knowledge. And this is something that we also see in the schools. We have children who attend, for example, Italian, German bilingual schools, and they say, well, I speak Spanish because I understand Spanish via their Italians. But as adults, we are a bit more ashamed to say, I, in some sense, have knowledge of Portuguese because the
we would not say that.
Because the expectation is that your Portuguese is quite high. Right? But this is not always the case, but still I can understand some Portuguese, I can understand French, and this is via my learning experience with Italian and Spanish. I worked a lot on Greek, for example, in linguistics, and so I can say that Greek is also part of my repertoire, even if I approach Greek just from the scientific point of view. So I've never like spoken Greek on the street, but just reflected on Greek from a linguistic point of view.
But you have a certain knowledge of Greek.
I have a certain knowledge of Greek. And I saw, for example, the connection between Greek and Italian, in the sense that they have a very similar syntax from many points of view. So this is like also part of my repertoire.
Well, if you study the history of the world, hence the history of languages, there are connections to these ancient languages.
Exactly, exactly. And so what we do in the classroom is actually to make children reflect on these connections. And among all the languages of their repertoire, and this enhances their learning experience. And whenever we do tests, we notice that if during the test, we in some sense refer to children's other languages or other language, this improves also performance in the target language of the test. So for example, if we do the test in English and we consider another language, which is, for example, Hindi, I'm referring now to some project that we have in India, so this might enhance learning of English. And we may think the opposite, that we may think the opposite because we think, okay, if we activate another language, we have more interference and we are like lost in this language chaos.
That's what we tend to think,
yes. Because we think that we don't have to mix languages, or we have like a very bad attitude towards like code mixing. But this is not the case, because actually code mixing is a way to learn languages. It's a natural way to express ourselves, and it's a natural way to make meaning in some sense, because via my language resources, I can make meaning in a different way with respect to when I use just one language.
So it's something that really makes you richer in many ways.
Sense, yes. In some sense, yes. And for example, also when we ask children to answer questions during cognitive tests, so sometimes we allow them to use all the languages they want to give the answer. And that's where we see the most creative answers, for example, because they are allowed to make meaning and to, in some sense, give the answer by relying on all their resources without switching off anything.
I was, as you were speaking, I was just thinking about, I think it has to do with this, about, so this voice we have in our head. And because I have this article, I share the link about the voice we have in our head. and when is it in one language or another.
Mhm.
So and it also changes. So here in Germany, I start thinking in my head words in German, but very often, even speaking, it's some words come easier in Spanish and some in English, and now some in German too.
Exactly.
So this is it flows better in any language.
Yeah, I totally agree. And this is what's happening. So in some sense, what you're saying, we can call it as languaging, right? So we all do this languaging. We all have experience of this languaging. So via language, we give form to certain thoughts. So in some sense, we need language to give a certain form to, in some sense, to shape our thoughts.
Yes.
And that's why, for example, if we have a problem, I say it in a very simple way, if we have problems, sometimes we need to verbalize these problems to see what's happening there,
Yes,
right? Because
yes.
otherwise we cannot see the problems. And this is called languaging. It's a word that comes from Vygotsky. And he was a famous pedagogist, actually, in the last century. I was doing wrong. That
20s.
comes from the 18th century.
Oh, okay.
The 19th century, because it is. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I say that comes from Vygotsky. You can cut where it comes from. That comes from Vygotsky. And what I wanted to say is that, so you have this languaging, but you might have also translanguaging. So this means that in order to shape your thoughts, you can rely on all your language resources. So in order to shape your thoughts, you can use your Italian, your Spanish, your English, and this enhances, in some sense, your reflection.
Even languages you don't really know, because there are certain words, niet in Russian.
Yeah, there's certain
Oui in
words
French.
that actually allow you to express this meaning better.
To pinpoint it.
Exactly.
And there are some words or phrases in a language that don't mean the same in any other language. We were just reading about Eat, Pray, Love in a class, and when she goes to Italy, it's for the dolce far niente.
Exactly.
So can you say this in any other language? No, it doesn't mean exactly that.
Exactly. So I mean, and this allows you actually to make meaning. I would not say better, because I mean, also monolingual speakers can make meaning, right? But in a different way.
But it adds.
It adds, like, in some sense. And this is the idea of this translanguaging. So giving, in some sense, thoughts a certain form, so shaping these thoughts by using all our languages. So this trans actually means across languages, so shifting across languages, but it means also beyond languages, in some sense that whenever we activate both languages, we might have different results with respect to when we are forced to reflect in just one language. Because this reflects our way of being, in some sense. So we are like that. We were born multilingual. If we were born multilingual. So the idea is that I should use the whole repertoire to reflect.
And this brings me to something that's also, I find fascinating, how much a language defines your identity. Because I'm not the same person when I'm speaking in Spanish and when I'm speaking in English and when I'm trying to speak German. and so it's, if you reflect on it, your personality sort of shifts a little bit. It's not like you're a completely different person, but it's a little bit different because of the kind of words you use. I don't know, in Spanish I can swear perfectly, of course. I know all the bad words and I can use them pinpoint. But I remember my Austrian mother, when she was trying to swear in Spanish, it would be funny, not insulting. And so it's this way also because, I don't know, languages make us feel different depending on which one we're using and where we are using it.
Yeah, I think it also depends on the fact that we have different experiences with the language. So, for example, I can make my own example, right? So I can use German in certain context and Italian in other context. So language is really context related in some sense.
Yes.
And so the fact that we have these multifaceted, in some sense, experience with the language shapes the way in which we make meaning. So the idea is that we make meaning via these languages, but this is related also to the fact that we use these languages in different contexts.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think, and because the idea is that as humans, what we want to do is actually to make meaning. And we can make meaning by using different languages. But of course, this making meaning, in some sense, or this meaning making, sorry, relates also to the fact that we live different languages in different contexts, and we have different experiences associated with the language. So that's why we have the impression that we have different personalities, right?
Okay,
but this reflects the fact that we have different experiences with that languages.
Yeah, so the meaning is different, sure.
The meaning is different, the context is different, and in some sense, if we want to extend your metaphor, right, every experience is a different self in some sense. So
yes, sure.
The person I am at the university is probably different with respect to the person I am at home, and that's why we might have
or
this
at
feeling,
work.
or at work, exactly. So this is like, that's why you might have this feeling.
Yeah, because you behave differently in different settings.
Exactly.
Yes.
But what is important to stress out, I think, with respect to this multilingual identity, is that it is a really dynamic concept in some sense, in the sense that our linguistic identity or multilingual identity can change across time. So the idea is that we have different methodologies, for example, to tap into this multilingual identity, so the languages that are part of my repertoire. And if I did this test to you now, and in 6 months' time, you might have a different configuration.
Oh, okay.
And this is quite nice because it's like dynamic.
In 6 months, in such a short time, it could be different.
Because let us imagine that you will meet like a Japanese person, like in this month, and you start to get acquainted to Japanese, and at that point, Japanese might enter, in some sense, your language repertoire, because in some sense it is related to an experience that you did. And so this is fascinating about this multilingual identity, because it is quite actually dynamic, and it can change through time.
But especially now, because I think we could talk about this forever. Maybe we make a second episode. But just to end this interview this time, you made me think about now with the streaming platforms and the video games. So we are exposed to different languages. For example, my sons watch a lot of manga in Japanese, in English or Spanish subtitles. This means they are learning words in Japanese.
And these words in Japanese enter or are part of their repertoire in some sense. And if they are quite open and they are not linked to this idea that in order to have a language in my identity, I have to master this language 100%, then Japanese is part already of their repertoire, and it's part already. And this happens in this transcultural world in which the borders between languages are quite are more fluid with respect to what we saw previously, right?
Or they don't even exist. So this is exactly what I wanted to get to. Nowadays, with this, you don't even have to leave your own room to be exposed to many languages, any language you would like, or platforms to learn languages online.
Exactly. And I know of persons that actually could really enjoy learning new languages via these apps that exist now, and they really enjoyed just this learning process.
No pressure from a teacher or from peers or whatever.
Exactly, just because they enjoyed it. And these languages are definitely part of their repertoire, of their identity.
And they do something great. They are designed so that because they have the challenges and you win coins and whatever, so you get rewarded. So they really they motivate you to keep going.
It's this gamification.
Go to the next level. Gamification, right.
Which is important in the school, but these apps actually show us that it is important also for adults, in some sense, to make this learning experience as enjoyable as possible.
So how important would you say learning new languages?
I think it's important in the sense that now in this era of artificial intelligence, right? I heard many people who said, for example, oh, it is not important to read, to learn a language, right? Because I can just use my iPad or I can just use my phone to translate everything. So at that point, we can just communicate by Google Translate, right? So just using translation to communicate with people. But then what we are missing is actually a lot of other components of so what we are missing is actually other components of language learning.
The human component.
The human component of language learning, what I was saying previously, the fact that via these languages I can make meaning in some sense, and I can make different meanings depending on the language I use, for example, to interface with reality. And what is important, it's also the strategy. The fact that learning a language actually enhances other cognitive mechanisms and cognitive processes that are important in other domains of life, for example. It's an enjoyable experience. I can have contact with other persons. So, I mean, we have just benefits of learning languages. It's not just a problem of translation.
Yeah, maybe when you're reading an article in the newspaper or something, or a post on X or whatever, so you understand the meaning and that's it. But if you want to go beyond that, when you go to another place, for example, if I went to France, I would not want to lose all my time looking at the screen to understand what everybody is saying or what the sign's saying.
There are persons who might want to do this, but actually they will lose, first of all, of course, the human communication, and also the idea that it is important also to find strategies to communicate with each other. So it's a really nice exercise of, in some sense, approaching the other person. I ask myself what you know, and you ask yourself what I know, and we find a common ground to communicate.
Maybe not one language or the other, but some
mixing in some sense, and this happens all the time. So we also speak to each other, and sometimes we mix English and Spanish, because we know that
or we do sense, this as I did now,
or I have a lot of gestures in some sense to accompany my speech, right? Because this is also part of my way of expressing myself. And so this is important, because if we don't have this, we lose in some sense the human part of the communication. We lose also a way to, in some sense, approach the same reality from different perspectives. It was what I was telling you before. So this meaning making across different languages.
To understand the world.
To understand the world in a better way. Because via all these languages, via all these semiotic resources, I can express myself, I can understand the world also in a better way. And plus all the cognitive strategies that are related to this language learning. So, I mean, there is no point in stopping learning languages.
So that's the message. Keep learning languages.
Keep learning messages.
Perfect. So a very nice talk with you. Thank you. And I really hope we keep on talking. There's the emotional part, and there's also so much more about
when you deal with language, you have to deal with all these components that are important to understand actually the way we approach language. So thank you very much for this really nice discussion.
Thank you.
We will see each other in next episodes.
Thank you. Sure. That's for sure. Thank you very much, Jacopo.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you.
You're welcome.